Thank you. Well, what I'm going to try to do this morning is give a crash course in capitalism. In other words, trying to very rapidly cover aspects of it that I think end up mystifying us, but really when you think in a monetary way are quite straightforward, and remove a few myths in the process of doing that, myths which are held by, some is held by the neoclassical school of thought at one extreme, but also held by a lot of popular critics of capitalism at another. And then I'll try to explain why it does crash, because it certainly obviously does crash regularly with the crisis like we're in now, but some people think that's an inherent, unavoidable necessity about capitalism. To me, it's something about the behaviour of the financial sector and the way we fall for it that causes that. So a rough outline of what I intend covering would be, first of all, I'm going to show you a cyclical model of capitalism. Now, conventional economic theory has modelled it as an equilibrium system. That is sheer nonsense. There is a tradition of non-orthodox economists who've perceived it to be inherently cyclical, and I'll show you what I regard as the best model of that. If I had lots of time and I was teaching a class, I'd actually physically build the model in front of you. What I'm instead going to do is show you a flowchart software package, take you through what the causal loops are in that package, and then simulate it and show you how it behaves. That's the first start. Let's get going with that. Okay. This software package is one of many simulation programs that are used by engineers to design complex systems and to analyse and understand them. These should be commonplace in economics, but economics has resisted them for 50 years, ever since Bill Phillips first tried to bring it in back in the 1950s. So I'll take you through step by step what's going on here. You see this, I'm highlighting K right now. K stands for the capital stock. So saying, and one thing we know about, there's a general empirical thing about capitalism, there's a rough proportionality between the amount of capital stock, however you might measure it, and the amount of output generated by an economy, however you measure it. And the relationship between the two is called the accelerator, which is a ratio between the value of capital as determined by statistical measurement and the value of output. And there tends to be a ratio of about 3. If you have $3 trillion worth of capital, you'll have an economy producing about $1 trillion worth of output. It varies between 2 and 4 for most economies, but 3 is a reasonable level. So what I'm saying is, here, if you feed in the amount of capital in your economy, whatever that might be, divided by the accelerator, you'll work out what your output is going to be. Stage 1 of the model. Okay with everybody? Okay. Once you've decided output, this is all a causal cycle I'm going through here. So when I say you, I mean this is what the economy itself is generating. I'm not talking having any personality making those decisions. So I've now got to the output, which economists normally indicate by Y for output. Don't ask me why, but that's the letter we use. Given the output, to produce that output, you need to hire workers. And if you know what productivity, how many units of output per worker, you can then, knowing the output being produced, you can then work out how many workers you have to employ. So A stands for labour productivity here. Now we then divide that output level by productivity per worker. I work out how many workers you have to hire, which is L for labour. That's rather more obvious. Given that, I can now work out a rate of employment. There's going to be a given population of people, and I'm just saying that's going to be N for number, okay, number of people. And you can notice I'm just using simple constants all the way through here. It's just a totally illustrative model. So N I've got standing there for 1, but that could be 100 million, 100 billion. It's just an indicator of scale. So divide the number of workers you have to hire to produce the output by the number of workers you actually have, and you get the employment rate. Now the next stage is something which is common to almost all economic models, and in fact I can't think of one that doesn't have it, some sort of relationship between the level of employment and how much wages of workers will change. It's called the Phillips curve after Bill Phillips, who's an extremely important and massively misunderstood economist who was once an engineer and tried to bring engineering intelligence to economists. The difficulty was it needed intelligence to understand it. And I love the graphic that the Homer brain graphic that Nicole showed yesterday, because that's what I think is the impact of doing an economics degree. You go from a normal human brain to a Homer brain, so you can't understand intelligent people like Bill Phillips. Anyway, what I'm now showing here is the conventional model that most people use as a linear relationship between the level of employment and how much workers will demand in terms of a wage rise. Bill argued for a non-linear one. I'll show you that in a moment, but I'm starting with a simple linear relationship here, which says that if the employment rate is 96% of the workforce is employed, therefore unemployment is 4%, workers will accept the current wage level, or there'll be no pressure bidding up wages. If that unemployment falls from 4% to 3%, workers will demand a 10% wage rise. And then if it falls to 2%, that'll demand a 20% wage rise, etc., etc. This is actually the rate of change of wages as a percentage rate of change per annum, would be 10%, 20%, etc. So you then can feed that into, you feed in the employment rate, and given that employment rate and the reaction workers have, as I've shown here, you get how much workers want wages to change per unit of time, which is the rate of change of wages. And you can then integrate that and multiply it by the initial, add it to the initial wage, and you get what the wage is going to be. So the rate of change of wages integrated, that gives you what the actual wage is. It's a simple mathematical process, and that's what these blocks, which we see 1 over S, that happens to be a symbol that a mathematician a long time ago used as a way of converting differential equations, which are very complicated to solve, into algebraic equations that are a bit easier. It's called a Laplace transform. That's being a bit too technical for this audience, but that's why that 1 over S is there. It's not divide by S, it's integration. Okay, that then gives you the wage rate. So let's go back again a bit here. Get the employment rate, work out how wages respond to that. That tells you the rate of change of wages. Integrate that, work out the wage rate itself, multiply it by the number of workers you've got hired, and you've got the actual wage bill. So I've now got to the stage saying what wages are given this whole system. Then this is a very simple two-class system. There's only workers and capitalists in this model. No bankers, okay, very, very simple. So you then, to work out what profits are, you subtract wages from output. So here's output, which we've already worked out further up on the screen. I then subtract wages from output and I've got profits. Now again, in this very simple model, which Richard Goodwin put together in 1967, and it was actually building a model that was verbally described by Marx in 1867, you can think what the level of profits are. And in the simple model that Marx put forward verbally and Goodwin turned to a mathematical model, capitalists invest all their profits. And then when they invest all their profits, that means that profits actually becomes investment. So if you integrate investment, you get the rate of change of the capital stock. Investment is the rate of change of capital stock. You integrate that and add it to the initial level of capital, and you work out what the capital stock is. So you've actually got a circular causal flow there. Okay? And this is a typical dynamic model. You have to have rates of change turning up in it. That's the basic mechanism. So what I've said is capital determines output, output determines the labour, labour determines the employment rate, the employment rate determines the rate of change of wages, the rate of change of wages determines the actual wage, the wage times labour determines the wage bill, output minus the wage bill determines profits, profits give you investment, investment is the rate of change of capital stock, you're back where you started again. Clear enough? A bit complicated first thing in the morning, but nonetheless it's true. Okay, let's simulate this model. And what you get out of is inherent cycles. The top graph you can see is employment in the blue curve, red is the employment is the red curve, the blue curve is wages share. You can see wages get to be very high and very low, and it's a nice symmetric, almost sine wave type pattern, but it's cyclical. And you can see down the bottom, if I look at the rate of change, the rate of economic growth now in percentage terms, it varies between minus 7% and plus 7%. So it's an inherently cyclical model, very simply put together, and you get cycles out of it. And to me, this is the actual base cycle that does happen in capitalism in an incredibly simplified way. So that's the sort of vision I teach my students as a starting point, to say the economy is inherently cyclical. And the cyclical behaviour isn't imposed by me saying there's any not curvy behaviour by anybody in the system. That's why I emphasise that my Phillips curve relationship here is quite linear. It's a straight line relationship. So how do the curves come about? Here you have two variables being multiplied together against each other. The wage rate, which is a variable in this system, multiplied by the number of workers who are hired, which is also a variable. And that is an inherent nonlinearity. And that's what makes the approach that I take to economics totally different to the neoclassicals. They try to get rid of anything like that. They don't actually know why they do it. But of course, if you have nonlinearities, normally you can't get equilibrium outcomes. They want equilibrium outcomes. So they make assumptions that linearize things. So for example, when it comes to macroeconomics, they assume what they call perfect competition, one of the many myths they've got, and in that system they believe the wage rates are basically a constant. They leave it out of the system. Wages are a given, set by what they call the marginal product of labour. So they end up turning something which is a variable into a constant, getting rid of the nonlinearities. When you don't do that, when you leave out what economists call the ceteris paribus assumption, which is a piece of garbage students are drilled into believing in first year, get rid of that thing and say everything affects everything else, you get cyclical behaviour. So that's stage one, showing an inherently cyclical model of the economy. Now when I put, you notice I said there's no nonlinear behaviour in the system, as I've shown it there. But of course we do have nonlinearities. The one that Bill Phillips was emphasising was that workers will, there's a maximum rate at which workers will tolerate wage cuts, a maximum rate at which wages are likely to fall. No matter how high unemployment is, it won't plunge. Equally, as you start approaching very, very high levels of employment, to entice more people into the workforce, you have to offer a higher and higher wage. So he said there's a nonlinear relationship there between the rate of employment and the rate of change of wages. Now, that nonlinearity doesn't give you cycles. What it gives you is more realistic scale of cycles. So I'm not going to try to explain this next diagram because what I've simply done is convert, add in the place of that linear one I showed you a moment ago, a nonlinear behavioural function by workers inside here. And this is now showing that same software in a slightly more complex way. The blue boxes you can see actually contain subsystems. This is how engineers use this type of software to design things as complicated as the Boeing 747 Dreamliner. So I don't think you can blame this software for the production delays. Okay, look inside wage change. I then have an exponential relationship now between the level of employment and the rate of change of wages. That's a further box down here. Again, if I had time, I'd be explaining what those actual function does, but it basically gives you an exponential reaction rather than a linear reaction of workers to the wage level. Now, just to take you back to one characteristic of the previous model, notice the rate of growth here of the economy. If I just simulate that and just show that, it's perfectly symmetrical. The ups and the downs are identical shape. Okay? You can't say there's anything different about the upturn to the downturn, same sort of period. We know in capitalism we have long, slow booms and sudden, short crunches. Okay? Booms take a long time. The crisis is very rapid. That's one of the stylised facts of capitalism. So what I've done in this next model is simply bring in that nonlinearity for wages, and I think it's if I've still simply got capitalists just investing all the profit. Just to take you through those two boxes, I jumped through very quickly there. There's profit. Notice that's the output of that box. That's then the input to this box, and I simply say that's the rate of change of capital. So I simply have the capitalists in this model investing all their profits again. I haven't changed that part of the previous model. So if I now simulate this one, I get cycles still. Notice you still get the same sort of cyclical behaviour in wages as I got in that model. That's the same chart there. But you'll notice the rate of growth now of the economy is like this. I'll just run this more slowly now. Let's just slow it down so it runs in real time. Make it about, say, running a year in 3 years in 1 second. And now we simulate that, and what you get is a long boom and then a short, sharp slump. I shouldn't try to say that first thing in the morning after not much sleep. Okay, so simply bringing in that nonlinearity, which is a realistic one, gives you a more realistic nature of the cycles in the system. But it's not necessary to get the cycles themselves. Okay. So I've got a cyclical model of the economy there, and it's generating profits and wages, but it's not taking account of the monetary system. So I want to now do, and I will build this one with you, is a monetary model. And a major issue I want to address here is a very prevalent myth amongst non-orthodox economists and critics of the financial system that debt necessarily rises because of compound interest. Okay? Tom and I discussed this last night. He said he has to have it proven to him. So I'm going to build you very slowly a model of a financial system. And if it was true that inherently the fact that you charge interest means that you can't repay the debt. That would mean whoever borrowed the money, if you looked at their bank account and there was only a constant amount of money in the economy, no change in it, that bank account would have to be heading down towards zero and negative. Okay? They've got to take on a debt obligation, they can't service it, they've got a certain amount of money they've borrowed, the interest takes a bit of that off to the bank, and they've got to go towards negative. Would you agree with that, Tom?
Unless additional loans are made to other people and put more money into the economy.
Well, I'm having a constant amount of money, no change in the amount of money in the economy. I'm going to build a constant money stock system where this set amount of money just circulates. Okay? So let's do that. Now, this is using another software package. This is a prototype of the software package I'm developing with the help of a grant from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. That's still in prototype stage. I hope to have it ready by this talk, but it's not quite there. There's one little software bug in terms of the visual display. Otherwise, I'd use that. This is a previous version which was designed for me by a person who actually challenged me on that very point as a computer programmer. And then we agreed on the analysis, and he rewrote his program to illustrate this particular issue, and he's since gone on to building his own program. I think he calls eSplice or something like that. But this is a way of building a monetary model using double entry bookkeeping, which is something I devised some years ago when I found it impossible to communicate the dynamic approach that I use to other non-orthodox economists. One of the great dilemmas of being an economist is you're normally taught economics by neoclassical economists. You're taught what they call mathematics by economists, neoclassical economists as well. And what you get is the ignorant teaching the ignorant. Okay? So even the people who become critics of that walk away with a very hobbled version of mathematical knowledge, which they then apply, and they don't use the concepts that exist in a basic course in mathematics. So I'm very much a fan of saying economists, if they want to become technical economists, should do mathematical courses, and they should be taught by mathematicians, not by other economists. Anyway, I gave up trying to communicate my system using differential equations. They simply couldn't understand them. And by accident, one of those economists, Scott Furwiller, challenged me and one of my models, saying, you must have made a mistake in double entry bookkeeping to get the results you're getting. And I knew I hadn't made a mistake, and it then occurred to me, well, I wonder if I can actually display my model using double entry bookkeeping. And I tried it out and I could. And then later I realized, hey, it isn't just a case of displaying the models this way, I can build them this way. So I've now built a new tool for dynamic modelling, and that's what this model is the prototype of, and the George Soros funded work will be a fully fledged economically oriented rival to that software package I showed you a moment ago that engineers use. But what I'm modelling here is like a 19th century free banking system. If you go back to the 19th century, there was a period, an experimental period in America and also Australia, where private banks were allowed to print their own notes. They had to go through a certain legitimisation with the state systems and buy a certain number of bonds and so on, but they could then print their own money, paper notes. And when they made a loan, they were giving people paper notes. And when the loan was repaid, it was repaid by returning the paper notes to the bank. I'm doing this to get away from one of the other, what I regard as myths in the area about the repayment of loans destroying money. Because nobody would ever imagine a banker getting a note and going, "Rip, thank you." Okay? Now they go, "That goes into the vault, thank you." So that's why I'm modelling a 19th century system here. Now, if you have that model, you start with the bank, private bank, having whacked, $100 million of notes into its vault. That's the start of the whole business. So the first thing it has to do is lend money from the vault. And what I'm looking here at is a simple system where they only lend to firms. I haven't got them lending to workers or households in any sense, just lending to firms. So to lend, they've got to transfer money from the vault to the firm. So I've got 5 accounts in the system. There's the vault, which records the notes the bank has in its vault that hasn't yet lent out. There's the loans account showing what loans are outstanding right now, where loans are only made to firms. There's the firm's deposit account, the worker's deposit account, and the bank safe. And I'm starting it off and saying, well, there's 100, let's say 100 million, okay? I'm not going to put a huge number there, but 100 standing for $100 million worth of notes in the vault, and there's absolutely no loans, nothing in the firm's account, nothing in the workers, and nothing in the safe. So all that's going to circulate in this economy is that $100 million notes once the bank lends them out. So the lending, first of all, is a transfer from the vault to the firm's deposit account. So that's a physical transfer of notes. And then what the bank does, it writes this down in a ledger. So what loans are, that a loan account is not a repository for notes. It's a record of how many notes have been lent out. Very important distinction. So what I show here is, first of all, the loan goes from the vault to the firms, and then the bank records that the loan has been made. So that A is just a symbol, just a placeholder. Well, what's A actually going to be? That is defined in this particular window here, variables or equations, as my programmer friend called them. And that, a COD equation. COD stands for coupled ordinary differential equations. It's more complicated than it needs to be, but that's the term that Cyril used for it. Now, A is going to be some rate related to what number of notes are left in the vault at the moment. So V just stands for an arbitrary number. I'm not trying to talk about the actual dynamics of behavioural attitudes here, you know, wanting to lend more because you've got a boom coming on, and being afraid to lend because you're afraid of not getting your money repaid, all that sort of stuff. I'm just looking at simple, is it possible for this system to be sustainable? So I'm using constants where in reality I should use variables. Okay? But this is just conceptual again. So I'm saying the rate of lending from the bank is proportional to the number of notes existing in the vault at any particular time. That's all that equation stands for. Are people okay with that one? There's some rate at which the money flows out of the vault, and it depends on how much is in the vault. That's all it's doing. And I'm saying it's V is 0.5. That's actually an exponential decay function, but you don't actually need to know that. Just put the V times what's in the vault, give V some value, see what happens.
Can I stop you there?
Pardon?
Can I just ask a question here?
Yeah.
You're arbitrarily putting 100 million in notes in the vault.
Yep.
That's an arbitrary number, and that's really potential money. It doesn't exist until a loan is made.
Which is why I'm working with the 19th century banking system, where if you're going to be a 19th century bank, you had to print the notes. How many are you going to know? If you're going to be a bank, this is literally how they began. They had to go to the state, they had to get the right to set up as a bank. That gave them the right to print a certain number of notes. They therefore printed the notes. Right. This is a physical record of how many notes are in the vault, Tom. I've got to have one. I can make it 200, I can make it 32. Doesn't matter. Okay?
It remains potential money until the loan.
Of course it is, but I've got to show what happens next. So let me get to that stage. Okay, so that's, first of all, the lending goes on. Now what actually happens? Well, if that's going to happen, the bank is going to simply, the vault's going to money pay out of the vault and end up with the firm. So I'll show you that as a simple stage, building this stage by stage. So what's actually happening here? The program then generates this flowchart system. I'll just shut those windows down for a moment. And what happens is the money gets lent out of the vault and ends up in the firms, and the bank does the recording over here of the loans, and the safe and the workers aren't involved so far. So I just show this as a player and bring up a graph. And then simulate it. It does exactly that. Let's speed it up a bit. So over time, all the money is pouring out of the vault into the firm's account, and the loan account's rising at the same rate. And ultimately, all the money will end up with the firms, none of it in the vault. Okay? Now, of course, that's not what bankers are interested in. They want the money in the safe, don't they? Okay, well, let's try that. That's stage one. I'm going to extend the table now and say, well, having recorded the loan, what the bank actually wants to do is charge interest on it. So I'm going to right-click here and bring up the little menu and say, add a new row. And I'm going to say, you compound the debt. The ones that lent you money, the banks say, well, we're going to increase the amount you owe us, which means that's going to rise by some rate, and we're just going to call B. That's compounding it. And that then requires the firm to pay the interest, which means they've got to transfer money out of their loan account and put it in this, transfer it to the safe that the bank want to have happen. And then if that's done, the firm then records, well, okay, you've paid that up, so you record the payment of interest, which means you subtract B from the amount shown as outstanding in the loan account. I'll just save this. Okay, so now we've got to define what B is. And that's fairly obvious, fortunately, because that's just going to be the rate of interest on loans multiplied by the amount that's currently lent out at time t. And now I've got to say what that rate of interest is, and I'm just going to say that that's, say, 5%. So the bank's charging 5% interest on the loan. Okay, having done that, I'm going to continue saving this step by step so I can build it up and you can see the overall dynamics. So I go back to the diagram now. I need to regenerate it. And I get a few more bits and pieces there, as you can see. Starts off messy, so you have to rearrange things a bit. So there's the lending to the firms. The workers still aren't part of the game. Let's put them over here. Now that the safes are now connected, as you can see, there's payment of interest. There's compounding the debt. That's recording the payment, and that's recording the loan in the first instance. I could make it neater than that, but that's just to make the flows more obvious. So we now save that and play that and see what happens. And now what you get, of course, the money first of all falls into the firm's account, then the banks charge interest on it, and the firms have to pay interest on the amount of the loan that's outstanding, and the money slowly seeps into the safe, and that accelerates over time. So if I speed it up a bit, you see ultimately all the money is going to go out of the vault into the firms, and then they're going to end up in negative as this keeps on going, and I might as well let it run until it gets to that point. Because the loan continues growing. The loan is being added to by both the payment of the money across and the compounding, and the firms are running out of deposit money to pay that. So you can see the amount of money in the firms is now going down, the amount of money in the safe is going up, the vault's running down to zero as before, workers are not part of the system yet, nothing happening with them, and if this keeps on going for long enough, the safe will take over all the money and the firms will then owe payments which they haven't got any revenue for. So this is the situation I think people actually have in their minds, where they see the firms necessarily going bankrupt. They can't repay the debt because they're being charged interest on it. So let's watch it run away and you'll see ultimately that red line will go down below zero. I think you can actually see it happening, and I could save a bit of time here by, if you accept it's going to go below zero at that rate, you can see it's not the same as the other, you can see the green lines curving down exponentially and flattening out towards zero, okay? But this one is plunging straight for the negative line. Oh, I'll wait, it's worth seeing.
What's the red line again?
The red line is the amount of money in the firm's deposit account. They're the ones who are paying the debt. Shortly, their debt payments are going to mean they haven't got any money to do it. They're going to be in negative. So you're seeing that's over here. See the firm's number? That's going down. That's the accumulated interest they've paid so far. So that's all turning up as the money in the safe. And this will now go negative. I'll let it do that so I can actually illustrate. This is the case, I think, that most people have in their minds when they say that you can't borrow money, be charged interest and make a profit.
Doesn't the klaxon come on right here?
Pardon?
Doesn't the klaxon start right here?
Yeah. Okay, now this gone negative, as you can see. I'll stop at that point. We'll do a bit of a change in recording. Let's stop right there. And I'll just save my own recording at that moment and come back to it in a